All right. Rock and roll. Welcome to the Heritage Radio Network on tour. I'm Katie Kiefer, and today we are broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barns in Pontac. Take two. Welcome to the Heritage Radio Network on tour. I'm Katie Kiefer. Today we're broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barns in Pocantico Hills, New York. We want to thank the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for making this coverage possible today. My guest is Anthony Mayans. Anthony is a restaurateur, but more importantly, he is the genius behind Zero Food Waste, a project that he began in California. Anthony, talk to us a little bit about how you came to create this entity, Zero Food Waste.
Sure.
Did I say Zero Food Print?
Zero
Zero
footprint.
Food Print. Sorry.
Thanks.
Zero
No
Food
worries.
Print.
And actually, that kind of speaks towards some of the disconnect between what current efforts are in food and sustainability and sort of what they need to be. Because in a lot of ways, there's a focus on conservation, like doing less harm, waste less food. And really one of, as we heard from an earlier talk a moment ago, one of the biggest and most practical solutions to the climate crisis is billions of acres of farmland becoming part of the solution and restoring the atmospheric carbon that actually used to be in the soil.
Yeah.
And so I came to this understanding in a pretty roundabout way. I started doing pop-ups in San Francisco in 2008. And this was
Pop-up restaurants.
pop-up restaurants, but it was before the term pop-up even existed. I think in some ways the phrase was coined to describe what was happening. And that turned into a permanent pop-up, which was called Mission Chinese, which is ostensibly a weird party Chinese restaurant. My friend and the chef and business partner, Danny Bowen, moved to New York and opened in what can only be considered like a unassuming Thai takeout window.
Really?
And then the restaurant won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012.
No kidding. That's fantastic.
And so we sort of found ourselves in these celebrity chef circles, rubbing shoulders with like the number one chef in the world, unearned maybe from a culinary perspective. But at some point my wife and I had a daughter and started realizing like, geez, like no chefs are really working on climate change.
Yeah.
Like maybe we need to use our access and our platform to really try to use that part of the food economy to make a difference.
So Zero Food Print grew out of sort of like thinking about the next generation.
For sure.
Essentially. And so when you talk about Zero Food Print in restaurants, what does that mean exactly? So you're trying to not only source correctly, if I can use that word,
Sure.
but you are also thinking about the farmers who you're buying from, how they are actually doing their farming. Is that the game of this, the sort of the end?
Yeah, exactly. So at the beginning, it is what you were describing, which is kind of like do an analysis of the restaurant, figure out the carbon footprint of the restaurant, make changes, maybe renewable energy, maybe make different choices on the menu, like use less beef from a feedlot and these kinds of choices.
Uh-huh.
Over time, in the past few years, I think there's been a lot of new science, biogeochemistry, among others, kind of telling a new story about farming and the food system. And to me, that story is that it's not really just about making different choices of what we buy, but that we need to kind of use our ability, the food economy, essentially, to actually fund a shift in the farming practices. And so we've shifted our focus from just kind of like making recommendations about operations and stuff to sort of using the money that restaurants are putting in to actually fund changes on farmland.
So what that means, though, when I was reading about you, in the brief moment that I was given to read about you, what I understood is that one of your plans is to actually put a little upcharge on the menu, depending on what the item is. So, for instance, if somebody orders a strip steak, you're going to charge a little extra, not just because the animal was raised by a farmer and it's locally sourced, which often adds a lot of cost to a menu for a chef, but also to kind of mitigate the sort of, or to assist the farmer in doing better practices on the farm? Am I making that sense?
Yeah, I think you could view our approach to something that's along the same lines as how renewable energy has made advances. And so if you imagine like the utilities company for, for a region, they might tell consumers like, we're going to add a $5 charge each month. You can opt out, and we're going to use that money to improve the grid of energy, right? And
Right.
switch it gradually to renewable energy. The food system doesn't really have that approach.
No, it does not.
And so this charge, whether it be like an extra dollar on a burger, whether a restaurant adds 1%, it's basically a way to do that, to improve the grid. And
Right.
so our belief, in a way, is that customers, citizens, are marching for, policy change on climate.
Yes.
And everybody kind of wants a way to solve the problem. And what's amazing to me is that science is kind of showing there is a way to solve the problem. And,
Right.
if we can do a thought experiment and let's say like a scientist at Exxon created a new invention, and you could put a couple drops of this invention in the gas and it would make no pollution.
Right.
That would be pretty amazing.
It would be.
And then imagine if that same scientist and his team kept working on it, and then the next year the version actually allowed that, you put a drop in your tank, and then instead of polluting, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere and burns it to make more gas for the car, right? That would be like, scientists would win the Nobel Prize, like global warming would be solved, all these things. Food and soil are actually offering that opportunity, and
Yes, on a scale that has to be pretty big, though, right?
yeah, but it basically means saving the world can come down to like just saving a few acres of it at a time.
So let's go back to the restaurants that are doing this. How do consumers respond to that? Are they responding, with approbation? Are they saying, wahoo, this is my new favorite restaurant because you're doing this? Or do they say, why should I be concerned about this? Does it really matter if I pay an extra 1%? How is that going to change the food system? How do you sell that story to your consumers?
So to me, like the 2-second pitch, if I'm walking by, is like, where does the money go? The money goes towards renewable farming and renewable energy projects. Okay, that's cool. If people really dive in, then almost every time the thought process is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's even possible. That's amazing.
Right.
So far at Mission Chinese in the past year in San Francisco, we've done this, and actually I wanted to kind of like stress test it and deal with angry customers if that arose and figure out what worked. So for us, it was a 3% charge.
Ooh.
And so that's quite a lot,
Yes, it is.
in theory. Over the year, one party of 2 opted out and one party of 4 opted out.
Wow.
And so we've served maybe like 35,000 people.
Amazing. That's
And
fantastic.
so to me, it sort of suggests that whether people don't even notice or whether they notice and in a way this is their entry point to actually engage with climate solutions, the only reason not to do it is inconveniencing that party of 2. And
Right.
and that's not a reason not to do anything.
Right, right. So talk a little bit about this program that you're launching in January, Restore California. What's that about?
So we kind of presented this work to people at the state of California department called the Air Resources Board, and they oversee the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is all the money coming in from cap and trade.
Uh-huh.
And so California is unique in that it has a program called the Healthy Soils Program,
Right.
which is paying farmers to essentially reverse global warming. And the problem is just that there's not enough money.
Yeah.
Like hundreds of farmers apply, a few are selected. Any funding that goes towards that, it could have gone towards something else. It's a really limited funding pool.
Right.
And so so they were very excited basically to embark on a public-private collaboration to engage consumers in this work that ostensibly has a lot of public benefit, but which, policymakers don't necessarily have like the political will and ability to just push through because of the constraints of politics and stuff. So
Yes, and the constraints of doing business as usual.
Right,
Which is
exactly.
very profitable for those who are doing business as usual.
Exactly.
Let's roll it back just for a second. I want you to explain, when you talk about, say, for example, this program or the Healthy Soils Initiative in California, and hundreds of farmers are applying, what is it that they need funding for? Explain to people what it means to be a farmer and to engage in that work.
Sure. So there's a lot of practices. They essentially are just good practices. Many farmers know all of these practices. They're conservation practices like compost application, cover cropping, managing the way cattle graze. And the only difference is that scientists have now not only recognized how important this is, but also are kind of able to estimate how beneficial they are, like how many tons of carbon this practice will take out of the atmosphere in this region if you're a tomato farmer or if you're a rancher or whatever. And so that ability to estimate it is allowing society, I guess, to like connect the dots and actually fund those practices because they want to achieve those outcomes.
Right, right. And you've brought a book along called Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. Why did you bring that book?
Well, so I talked about the Sparty restaurant, Mission Chinese Food, but we also ran a restaurant called The Perennial, and we were sourcing ingredients that were trying to tell this story. We were baking bread from a perennial grain called kernza. We had a whole animal butchery program from beef that was from cows that were raised through this kind of process, like carbon ranching.
Right.
And shortly after that, this book came out that sort of like, to me, like validated a lot of the things we were trying to showcase. And, I wanted to just bring this because if you're interested in solutions to global warming, in a lot of ways, this is like the playbook.
Right.
And so a lot of climate experts came together to identify and quantify all these solutions. Basically what it finds overall is that if we adopt these solutions at just the plausible rate of adoption, we can solve global warming.
What would be the plausible rate of adoption? What do you mean by that?
For each category, it's different. So for like solar panels, the experts in renewable energy say, okay, I think we could get to like 63% renewable energy or whatever it is. But so for each different strategy, whether it's, wind turbines or regenerative farming, they estimate that rate. So overall, we could solve it. The cost would be 1% of GDP only.
Okay.
And so that's like quite optimistic to me. And
Yeah.
then it also kind of quantifies the role of food and farming. And so food and farming related solutions are about half of the total. And in society, they get almost no funding.
Right.
And then overall, all the solutions have a benefit, like the whole suite of practices, it makes almost like $2 or $3 per dollar invested. Like there's a reason to do it anyway. It's like a new green economy. But the food and farming related solutions, like, managing the way cattle graze, regenerative agriculture, those actually offer a $30 benefit for each dollar invested.
For each dollar. Wow.
And so it's like, it's a no-brainer. Society wants to do this. They just don't know it's an option yet.
That's right. And how do you see this? How do you see this scaling? Like you're in a state that has a particular interest and focus on climate solution, because California faces so many additional burdens on its, in terms of the extreme weather events and the drought and the fire and all of the other stuff. But what about the Midwest? What would you say to like, your average grain farmer in the Corn Belt or something like that? Like how can you extrapolate a program like yours into other states where there's going to be a lot of pushback? I think. I could be wrong, of course, because I'm not a farmer in the Corn Belt, but it seems to me that it's very hard to move that needle in those particular areas.
Sure. Well, the crux of this program, when you boil it all down, is healthy soil.
Right.
So I can't understand who would be against healthy soil, except for like maybe a few, chemical agriculture companies or something. But
Yeah.
Pretty much every other person in the world should be up for healthy soil. The fact that farming is not renewable
Yeah.
is insane.
Totally crazy. I couldn't agree with you more. It's just, I'm thinking of it from the point of view of like these giant agricultural conglomerates, and this is where the monopolization of the farming, industry, I guess would call it, is at its most pernicious, right? Because basically now you have a whole, generation of farmers that have grown up using Monsanto seeds or Dow DuPont, and those companies have kind of a lock on the seed market, so it's very hard, for example, to find other sources in the quantities that you would need to actually totally change the way you farm. Lots of people can do cover cropping. It costs some money, and that's something that your project Restore will help them with, right? Restore California.
Yeah, that's the goal, is like literally just to pay for the cover crop
Right.
seeds, to pay for the compost.
But I think people don't. I think people don't recognize just what that costs farmers. And that this has to be kind of a national policy move. Although I think the grassroots approach is clearly the only one that's working right now. But how do you see that? I guess my real question is, how do you see scaling this out to the point where you actually have people like Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley going, yeah, man, let's support some regenerative farming funding in the Farm Bill next time around, the lock of old white men on business as usual is a pretty tough boulder to roll uphill.
Yeah, I hear you. And again, that's sort of where I think the consumer has a role to play, because at the moment, a consumer buying the really good product, that's essentially making a choice within an existing food system.
Yes.
And what we need is to actually just change the food system. And I think that, again, the science is kind of showing that there's so much benefit to actually changing the food system that consumers should be glad to pay 1% at a restaurant to actually change the food system.
If you are the person who's got the money to go to the restaurant that does that, I guess is my, I always go back to like the American obsession with cheap food is so powerful. And outside of the coasts, it's I don't know how much this message is penetrating to the consumer. And I agree with you. It's voting with your dollar, and that's what's rolled things forward in the last decade, that's for sure. But I just wonder how
but where
much
this is a
further
little
you can
different
go.
is it's kind of saying that this isn't like buy the $15 grass-fed burger.
Right.
This is saying McDonald's can send 5 cents per burger and change its existing supply chain.
Right.
And that is the change that we actually need. Like
That is
currently,
the change we need.
The food system feels a little bit like 1% racing to the top and 99% racing to the bottom.
Yeah.
And this is basically a way for the 99% to restore itself.
Right. I love it. I think it's a great program. It's a wonderful thing. So tell people again, it's called Zero Foodprint.
Zero Foodprint is kind of the restaurant-facing program.
Right. And you won a large award, or not that large actually, but you won a nice award from the Basque Culinary World. It's called the Basque Culinary World Prize. And what was that? Who gave you that prize?
So it's a collaboration between the Basque government and the Basque Culinary Center.
Amazing.
And it's to recognize chefs who are doing work outside the kitchen.
Yeah. Amazing. We don't have that here.
No, but
Like,
hopefully we will soon. Yeah.
We need to start that. We need to have more. And do you have a broad spectrum of chefs who are following your lead and adopting Zero Foodprint?
Sure. Some of the best chefs in the world are in the program.
Fantastic.
As well as like a corner burger shop.
And so people can just literally go to your website, and there is a form to fill out that explains kind of what you're signing up for and how to identify your food print, and then you guys consult with them on how to reduce that food print. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, more or less. There's a lot of information on the website, and so restaurants differ in kind of, they come in every shape and size. It could be like the cafeteria at Google, or it could be a sandwich shop on the corner. And so it's a little bit more complicated than that, but more or less, yes.
That's fantastic. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network on Tour. Thank you again to the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts for making our on-tour coverage possible, and to Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for welcoming us here for the Young Farmers Conference. I'm Katie Kiefer, and stay tuned for more. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks.
Good. Welcome to Heritage Radio Network On Tour. I'm Lisa Held. Today we're broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barns. We want to thank the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for making our coverage possible. So now I'm here with Ariana Taylor Stanley, the Northeast Regional Organizer for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, who also co-owns and operates Here We Are Farm in Trumansburg, New York. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I love the name, Here We Are Farm. It's the cutest name.
Thanks.
Tell me about it. Tell me about the farm and how did you come up with that name?
Sure. Yeah, we're a pretty small scale vegetable farm outside Ithaca, New York. We sell through a 50-person CSA and to a couple of local farmers markets. And the name just came about. We had both my farming partner and I, who started the business together, worked on a crew together at a different farm, and we spent half a season brainstorming, and one of our crew members came up with the name, and it's fun because people are looking for us in the farmers market, and here we are.
Love it. How did you personally get into farming?
I came to farming through the environmental movement. I was really involved in climate activism about 10, 15 years ago, and began to see that our food system is responsible for so much of the environmental problems that the climate movement is working on. And so I thought I'll just go kind of work on developing an understanding of how food is grown, go work on a farm for a season, then I'll go back into organizing and activism. But I kind of got stuck, and I decided I liked farming and I like being able to be part of a solution. It was exciting and invigorating to organize against, coal-fired power plants and carbon pollution. But when we're in the sustainable agriculture movement, we get to organize for something, and it feels good and empowering, impactful to be part of the solution.
Right. Yeah, it can be draining when you're constantly talking about what's wrong, right? And
Totally.
then to kind of reframe it can be empowering.
Yeah, I love to work on solutions.
Amazing. So in terms of policy solutions, so you're presenting a session at the conference called Advocacy for Young Farmers. My first question is, farmers are really busy farming, right? And there's lots of organizations and activists like you were before who are working on policy. How important is it for farmers themselves to really engage in advocacy and get off the farm and work on policy?
It's so important. Yeah, I think, you're right. There are a lot of people who are paid, and that means that they're probably representing interests with money to advocate for policies that represent the sort of status quo in terms of our food system. But if we want to have change that can really both be an environmental benefit, change that moves towards agriculture that's regenerative and sustainable, that is also helping dismantle existing systems of oppression that exist in our food system, the people who are directly impacted by those systems and who are directly involved in creating the alternatives need to be at the table making those policy solutions. And honestly, the voices of constituents are much more powerful. I live in rural central New York, and my member of Congress and I don't see eye to eye on everything, on a lot of things, but last year when the Farm Bill was being written, the last Farm Bill passed in 2018,
right.
The House version of that Farm Bill eliminated a lot of programs that I was personally looking forward to using. And one example of that was the Organic Cost Share Program, which actually helps farmers pay for their organic certification. That's something we're doing this winter, and I'm really looking forward to being able to be reimbursed for some of those costs. And I went to a town hall and said to my member of Congress, did you know the Farm Bill that you just voted for, or that you're about to get the chance to vote for, eliminates a program that I, as your constituent, am planning to use. And he said, no, I didn't know that, and I'm going to look into it.
He had no idea.
And he said, this is a real issue, and he actually wrote a letter about the organic cost share program to ask that they put that funding back in the Farm Bill, and it did end up in the final Farm Bill. And so it's different for you to be eye to eye with your member of Congress. I'm a farmer. I live in your district. You're waiting for my vote. This is something that matters to me. That spoke to him just as much as a paid lobbyist coming from a big corporation, and maybe even more.
Right, absolutely. Really having a person there to
Totally.
Lived experience. And you're on the grassroots team for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. So are you going out and actually trying to get other farmers engaged in the process? And are young farmers excited to be engaged in policy? How difficult is that?
Yeah, so the way that NSAC works, that's the acronym for National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. We're a coalition. So we have members around the country, including Stone Barns is one of our members, the National Young Farmer Coalition that's here, other members in the Northeast region I work directly with. I saw Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association was represented here too. So all those members, they work directly with farmers on the ground.
Okay.
At the NSAC office, we have some relationships with farmers, and we do bring them in for events and fly-ins, but we mostly work with our farmer-facing organizations who want to have a voice in policy, and they set our priorities. We're responsive to what things their farmer members want to work on, and then we help them engage. So so here we are in Terrytown. Nita Lowy, who represents the congresswoman from this district, sits on the appropriations committee. So we just went through that process, and I got to talk to Jess, who's sitting here in this room, to say, hey, can you connect with that office to get her to make sure that the final spending bill for the government doesn't leave out important programs that one half of the versions going into the Senate version does leave out. So she was involved. She wrote letters to that office. She got to build that relationship. And then she can also work with her farmers on the ground to bring in that support. So we organize with organizations. We call them the grass tops, the people that organize the grassroots throughout the region. And then I also have the special superpower of also farming, but that's my full-time job. This is my side hustle. So I also have lots of relationships with farmers in my community and other farmers that I've built through my network as an organizer throughout New York and New England. So in that way, I also get direct feedback on a particular problem people are encountering when they go to sign up for a conservation program. And we use both. So we work with organizations and farmers. And I have to say, yes, there's definitely excitement. People are feeling the need to engage in the political process in new ways all the time. And at least where I'm at, people are interested in engaging. They care. They just want the information and to know, okay, this is what's happening. Now is the time to make a phone call.
Right. Well, and especially farmers, they're so busy. So it's you're providing the service that this is the issue, and here's who you can call, right? They kind of need that help, maybe. They can't spend all day researching an issue if something needs to be planted or harvested.
Sadly, no.
So in terms of policy at the federal level right now, what are some of the biggest issues that you're working on that affect young farmers?
Well, there's a lot. And one issue that I hear about and talk about whenever I connect with farmers, young and otherwise, is climate change, obviously. And that's an issue that's slow going from the federal policy perspective, but it's something we are starting to focus more and more energy on. And one thing that we're actually doing here today, actually right now, I have a booth in the next room over where people can sign on to our Farmer Climate Letter. So our member organizations and National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition are collecting thousands of signatures of farmers who agree that climate change is a problem, it's a threat to agriculture as we know it, and that sustainable regenerative agriculture can and should be part of the solution, and that farmers are on the front lines and deserve a voice. So that's one thing that we're working on that people can plug into, and that will help inform the policy that ends up happening at the federal level on climate. And, interestingly, though we don't yet have a comprehensive piece of federal legislation addressing climate change, which is long overdue, there are actually federal programs that are right now paying farmers to sequester carbon in the soil and to farm in ways that help address the climate crisis. And some of those programs are about to open for sign up. So this winter feels like a really critical time, given that the clock is ticking on climate, for beginning farmers to know that they can get funding. I actually, on my farm, just signed up last season, so I'm going to get to implement it this season for something called the Conservation Stewardship Program. And that program is actually paying me to plant cover crops, and cover crops are just a real physical way to get extra green stuff growing that's going to capture carbon out of the air and put it in the soil. That is carbon sequestration at its most basic, lowest tech, but kind of most advanced level.
Yeah.
The Conservation Stewardship Program also allows farmers to be paid for reducing their tillage. Anytime you disturb the soil, it releases carbon and other greenhouse gases into the air. It pays farmers to plant perennial crops. So it's a huge climate crisis mitigation tool that you won't see climate change anywhere in the authorizing legislation for that program, but it does talk about soil health and even weather volatility, which is a pretty good code word. So if we can help farmers translate that in their heads that, when we're talking about soil health, that's a program that's actually going to pay me to help address climate change on my farm, to mitigate it, to both help reduce my emissions and to make my farm more resilient to weather volatility as it happens, to drought and flooding, that farmers can use this program that already exists, and we just need people to sign up. And there's also a comment period open right now where people can weigh in on some changes that happened from the last Farm Bill.
Right. And programs like that, like the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and there's EQIP, right? There's the Organic Cost Share you mentioned. You've applied for the Organic Cost Share, you've applied for CSP. One thing I've heard from farmers is it's difficult to go through the actual application process. Was it hard? How much time goes into that, and is it worth it at the end?
Good question. Yeah, definitely worth it. We've also used the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, like you mentioned, to build a high tunnel, which reimbursed all of our costs for a tunnel that cost about $10,000. So that's a huge savings for our farm, and it's going to extend our season earlier in the spring and later in the fall so that we can provide more local food and also help our business be more economically resilient.
Right.
And same for the Conservation Stewardship Program. It is for my farm, it's kind of weird to talk numbers, but for my farm, it's going to pay us about almost $4,000 a year for 5 years to do those practices, which makes it really worth your time to sign up. And something to know for farmers who are considering doing that is, for the Conservation Stewardship Program, there's actually a minimum amount. So you're going to, I should have written the number down, but there's a minimum amount over $1,000 just for signing up. They'll make it worth your while. So even if you have a very small acreage farm, these programs are still going to be worth your while. And the more conservation you're doing going in, the better your farm is already at conservation, actually the better you will be rewarded. There's a multiplying effect. However many practices you're already doing, they count those up and they multiply that by your acreage and your practices to get your payment. So the better you are at conservation, it actually rewards you for doing that. So they're very worth it for smaller, even small scale, sustainable farms. And these programs also prioritize beginning farmers and farmers who have been historically excluded from these programs, farmers of color, women farmers, veteran farmers. So know that going in, that these programs, that USDA wants us in the door. They want to serve historically underserved groups. And so there are set-asides. And for EQIP, there's also a new provision that's helping this get up and running. There's actually an advanced payment option where you don't have to front. When I signed up for this program, I had to cash out that $10,000
Right.
to build my greenhouse
And then it was a
get
reimbursement?
reimbursed. But there's a new advanced payment option where you can get half of that money up front.
Wow.
And then you have to bring the other half, and then you get it all reimbursed. But that's really helpful, and you can use that. You can get that half up front and take that to a bank and get a loan for the rest if you need to. So it helps farmers who are, in the government's word, lower resource or facing other barriers to accessing that capital, because as we know, there are a lot of systemic barriers that keep people out of agriculture, and those apply especially to people facing racism, classism, sexism. So where we can use programs that account for that, that will help level the playing field for farmers of color, women farmers, and other farmers that have been excluded.
Yeah. I think it's so great when you throw out the real numbers, because those things it's important to hear that, like, oh, you got $10,000 to build this hoop house. Like, that makes it real and tangible for a farmer that is maybe thinking, is it worth it to go through all this paperwork? And right.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me, that also paid for the crew that built it. I didn't have to spend a month or, put my crew on the job. I actually hired in some neighbors to help me build that tunnel. So it was super worth it for me.
Yeah. How do you suggest farmers figure out which of these programs might work for their farm? Like, do you just go on the USDA website and sort through things, or does NSAC have resources that farmers can access?
We do, yeah. So NSAC does have, we call our grassroots guide to federal food and farm programs, which is on our website, which is sustainableagriculture.net. And that is a great resource for folks trying to kind of sort through their options. But really, the way to sign up for these programs is very old school. You talk to your agent at the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. So you got to get to know that person.
Right.
It's very old school. There's no way to sign up online. They might have the forms online, but you can't really even, the closest to signing up online you're going to do is to, email a PDF to someone. There's no online sign up, not yet. So what you're going to do is you're going to get to know your agent at NRCS. They're going to come out to your farm. They're going to help identify things that you might be able to change on your farm to improve your conservation practices and what programs might be able to fund that work. And then they're going to work with you to get the funding to do that.
Right. So you got to go a little old school. It's not.
Yeah,
the federal government isn't quite, digitized and all that.
Not yet. And it's a barrier. That puts a lot of discretion in the hands of that agent. And if that agent carries a personal bias, that will apply to you. So that's something real to know going in. But there's lots of things that farmers can do. You are entitled to a receipt for service. So if you go in and you ask to use a program and they say no, you can get documentation of that. But yeah, you are building a good relationship with your NRCS officer agent is a really important prerequisite to using any of these programs.
Perfect. So in terms of state and local advocacy, so we've been talking about federal programs, and we're in a time right now where, especially on things like environmental conservation and climate change, the federal government is not necessarily out ahead on these issues. So are you also engaging with farmers to affect policy at the state level? And is that an avenue for making change that maybe can't be affected at the federal level?
Yeah, so National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition only works on federal policy directly, but you are correct that, especially in terms of climate policy, the change is happening at the local and the state level, and often that those policies that originally are piloted at the state level are then copied at the federal level and magnified. If they're working at the state level, that can be like an incubator, and then we can take those and turn them into federal policy. So we keep an eye on what's happening at the state level, and of course, most of our members spend a lot more time working on state policy than they do federal policy. So whenever we get folks in the room together to talk about federal policy, there are side conversations going on about how we can, as a region, connect on some sort of regional climate policy. How can we compare what different states are doing to make sure we get the best outcomes across the region? And that's really helpful to have these state policy whizzes in the room as we're talking about how to do things on the federal level, because they apply that knowledge and turn it into the federal policy advocacy work that we work on directly.
Right. how's New York State doing? Like, are there, I feel like there was some talk about soil health legislation in New York. Is New York a little bit ahead maybe in terms of state legislation for farmers and climate change?
New York does have a new climate policy that was recently passed. I don't work directly on state
Right.
policy, so I don't want to speak out of turn or give you misinformation about New York policy, but I know Kaitlin Arnold from National Young Farmer Coalition is speaking next, and
Yes.
they were very active in organizing around and supporting and working on the New York legislation that passed. So she might have more information about what's happening at the state level. My focus is more federal, but it is really exciting to have that as a priority, and there is some state level funding for farmers to do climate mitigation work on their farms as well. So that's a great resource.
Great. Well, thank you, Ariana. We're going to wrap up, but I feel like you gave so much information that farmers could use really, really urgently. Like, programs that exist right now that, policies, there are policies you need to work on and advocate for, but then it's great to know that there are so many programs that you're actually using and that farmers can access now.
Yeah, now is a great time. It's never too early to go into your NRCS office and ask them to come to your farm, because once you're in the system, there's certain things you need to do, like getting like a farm number and things like that before you can apply. So it's never too early to walk in that door. Winter's a great time to do it, get to know your agent, and begin to ask about the programs you might sign up for this next spring. And for folks who are interested in signing on to our Farmer Climate Letter, you can do that at our short link is bit.ly/Farmer Climate Letter. So if you're farming, please sign. If you're not a farmer, there will be other ways to plug into this work. We're hoping that this letter will showcase how many farmers are especially committed to this work and especially concerned about the climate crisis. So if you are farming, we'd love your support.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network on Tour. Thanks again to the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts for making our on-tour coverage possible, and to Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture for having us at the Young Farmers Conference. I'm Lisa Held. Stay tuned for more.
To the Heritage Radio Network on tour. I'm Katie Kiefer. Today we are broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference of Stone Barns in Pocantico Hills, New York. We want to thank the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for making our coverage possible. My guest today is Kaitlin Arnold. She is the National Chapter Manager of the National Young Farmers Coalition. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kaitlin. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about what the coalition does?
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
So the National Young Farmers Coalition is a national policy and advocacy organization working for young and beginning farmers across the country. So what we do is try to make it easier for young farmers who want to enter careers in agriculture be able to do so and be able to succeed in those careers.
And there's no age cutoff, is there?
There is no age cutoff
Farmer.
officially. You don't have to be, well, young and beginning. So I would say most of our farmers that we represent are between 20 and 45.
Okay.
But we don't, there's no official age cutoff. That is
Gotcha.
my number one question I get asked.
I bet. Yeah. Well, you call
Am I
yourself the
too
young...
old to be
Yeah,
a young
right,
farmer?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So now you are the National Chapter Manager. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a farmer-led chapter network. We have 45 chapters in 28 states across the country. So my role is to support those chapters and to also help start new ones in places where we don't have a chapter yet.
Uh-huh. And when you talk about your chapter network, are they all sharing best practices? Are they sharing information, say, about conservation stewardship programs or EQIP, or or are they collaborating?
All of the above. All of the above.
So do you find that young farmers are more collaborative or less collaborative or the same as the regular our aging farmer population?
That's a hard question to answer because I'm less familiar with the older farmers in our country and their forms of collaboration that they've had throughout the years. But I would say that our network of farmers is extremely collaborative. We have farmers that in their chapters have formed cooperative buying clubs, so buying
Right.
things in bulk. We have farmers that have formed equipment sharing networks, tool libraries. Our chapters do farm tours and workshops on each other's farms. They do crop mobs where they all go to one farm for a whole day and bust out a bunch of projects, and
Right.
then they'll go to someone else's farm the next month. So really, really collaborating with one another, sharing the knowledge that they already have.
Right.
And then also disseminating new information through us and through their other networks.
That's such a happy story. I love that.
Yes. It is a happy story.
It's really
That's
great.
the happy side of
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
Now, but there are some less happy sides of being a young farmer, and one of them is something that I know is being considered in a legislative package, which is the Young Farmers Success Act, and that is student loan forgiveness. So, talk a little bit about the impact of student loans on beginning farmers, and what exactly that means in terms of hampering their ability to move forward.
Yeah. So we are finding that young farmers who are entering agriculture now are highly educated. This is a highly educated group of young people who want to be stewards of the land and want to feed their communities, but they have college degrees. So when you try to enter a career such as farming that is very capital intensive,
Yeah.
and you're entering already with an existing debt load of student loan debt, it makes it that much harder to gain access to the capital that you need to start your business and keep your business growing. So that means land for equipment, startup costs initially, and then land for equipment as you grow, money for equipment as you grow, and then funds for purchasing land or leasing land down the road. So when young farmers have student loan debt, often what we're seeing is that they are either putting off farming altogether so that they can pay their student loans first, so working other jobs and waiting to become full-time farmers, or they are not growing their businesses in the way that they want to. So they're not purchasing land and able to expand their business. They're not able to hire more employees, even though they might be in the place where they feel ready to do that. But if they're paying, $500, $900 a month on their student loan debt,
Jiminy Cricket.
how are you going to do that and get a bank to approve a loan for you to be able to purchase that equipment you need or purchase the land that you need to farm
But
on?
what's interesting to me about that is, like if you're a contract farmer with Tyson or Smithfield, your local bank is more than happy to front you $1 million to build a couple of hog houses or some chicken houses.
Yep.
And so I'm just curious, like, why is it so much harder for younger farmers to get into the game? Why do banks? I wouldn't say they discriminate against, but why is there less interest in getting young farmers onto the land, do you think?
Yeah, I think young farmers are seen, especially young farmers who are smaller scale, growing, the sort of niche products such as, vegetables, maybe grass-fed livestock, raw milk or grass-fed dairy, making cheese, ice cream, things like that. They are seen as a very risky group to banks. Farming is any type of farming is risky.
Yeah.
You don't make very much money, and any sort of setback can really be a crisis financially. So, yeah, I think banks just see, they see a young farmer who doesn't have capital to back them up as a very risky proposition.
Huh. It seems to me that raising chickens could be equally risky, but I don't want to bog down in that.
I
But
agree
what
with you.
mean,
Yes,
right? It's like, you could have a whole flock wiped out, and then you're not going to make your payment on your loan for your house, and then you're going to get foreclosed on, and that happens over and over again.
Happens all the
and yet
time.
somehow banks are happy to extend that credit to those guys. That's another conversation. But let's move on right now. Now, you yourself are something of an expert in the mental health issues that plague the farming community. I was curious that the young farmers, they haven't figured out yet that they're not going to make any money. So, what kind of mental health issues do you see in the field with this younger constituency?
Yeah, a lot of the same issues that aging farmers are facing, young farmers are facing too, but just it looks a little bit different. So oftentimes young farmers will be farming on marginal farmland because it's where they can afford to lease or buy land. And often that land is quite isolated. So a lot of young farmers are not farming and living in the places that they actually want to be farming and living. That are close to markets, close to their existing community of friends and family. They're farming far away in pretty rural, isolated places on marginal land because that's what's affordable to them.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot of, the isolation that comes with that.
Well, a lot of times, but aren't these guys farming leased land a lot of times? So that can be many
Leased
miles
and
away.
owned, yeah.
Leased and owned, but that can be many miles away. That's what you mean when you're saying that they're farming somewhere distant from their community, and so it's that.
Yeah, so rural isolation is one piece. And the second piece is just with climate change, we're seeing these disastrous weather events happening just closer and closer together. And just one of those events can really wipe out a farm for an entire season. And it's so hard to bounce back from that.
Yes, sure.
So what we're seeing is more of a cascade of these issues rather than farmers are struggling mentally because of X or because of Y. It's because of all of these factors combined. The financial piece is huge as well. if you are working 80 hours a week to try to keep your farm afloat, because that's the labor that it takes, but then you also have to work off the farm. So you're then working 100-hour weeks and not taking any vacation, any rest. It's too much. And we're just seeing that young farmers are having to take on so much just to be able to continue to farm. It can really build up that cascade of effects.
In fact, don't most, I've read a statistic that most farms actually now have somebody who is working off farm in
Yes.
order to maintain. So what's the percentage in your constituency? What is the percentage of young farmers who are
Working another job?
Yeah.
Probably almost 100%.
No kidding. Oh my God.
Yeah, with our
that's
farmer
tragic.
members in our chapters, many are working an off-farm job, or their partner is working an off-farm job, but also
Right.
working on the farm so that one of them can be full-time on the farm.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say almost 100%.
So we have the financial piece, which is hugely difficult to manage. And when the people who decide to become young farmers, you've mentioned that some of them are as old as 45.
Yes.
They've had careers already. And
Some have.
Yeah, some of them have.
Yeah.
So what do you think drives them towards a career in farming?
Yeah.
Given that, I mean, you don't go into this business without your eyes open. You really, I mean, the age of, well,
You'd
some
be
of them do.
surprised how many people do, actually.
Well, it's like people who go into the restaurant business and
and then
think
they
they're
don't
going to
last
make
very
money.
long. Yeah.
That was sort of my next question.
Yeah.
Like, how many of them stay on the farm? How does it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, first I'll address the first part. So a lot of the farmers that we represent are not going into this as a second career.
Okay.
So they're going into farming straight out of college. And that looks really different. So when you've already had a decade of another career, say in something that pays you what most people get paid an average
Right.
of.
And you might not have student debt by then.
And you might not have student loan debt. Your starting point is going to look really different than someone coming straight out of college into farming and hasn't had that 10 years of paying off loans or setting aside money in the bank to be able to put towards their farm business. And I would say our farmers are more the second. They're coming into it directly and trying to make it work even though they don't have that savings. Why do people do this? Why do people choose this? Someone just asked me this in the other room. When somebody wants to do this work, it almost feels like there is no choice.
Really?
Like they do not have a choice. So I farmed
true
for
vocation, in other words.
It is a true vocation. I farmed for a decade before my work with National Young Farmers Coalition, and it's just when you feel drawn to this, nothing else compares.
Wow.
I don't really even know how to put it into words, but that's the best way I can put it. And a lot of people, but the sad part of that's an amazing thing that people feel this type of passion.
Yes.
And young people are feeling this and wanting to do this.
Yes.
The difficult pieces that we're trying to combat are, one is a lot of young people feel this way and can't do it because of financial reasons.
Right.
Two is that a lot of young people feel this way, they start farming, and then we lose them, usually around the 5-year mark.
Really? Why do you think at 5 years?
I think 5 years is a point where you're probably either at the point of you're tired of working for other people's farms and you
Okay.
want to start your own.
Yep.
Or you're at the point where you need to expand your business
And you don't have the resources.
and you don't have the resources.
Right.
Or you're at the point where maybe you're now in your 30s and you want to start a family. And a lot of young farmers they have to choose between, do I want to continue doing this career that I love, or do I want to have a family and be able to pay for that and put money into retirement?
So you know what that leads me to is legislation. Because all roads lead to
Don't
legislation.
they all? Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about how you support farmers to create legislation on a state level as opposed to a federal level. But how do how can states better support young people who want to go into agriculture, and how are young people organizing in your coalition to start moving legislation into programs that might be more beneficial or make their lives easier?
Yeah. So state level is really where our chapters come in. They come in on the federal policy level as well, but our state level legislation takes serious on the ground work, meeting face to face with representatives, getting representatives out on your farm, being able to tell your story. So our chapter networks that are interested in policy are really shifting things on the state level with our support. Some recent things over the past couple of years, our Central Minnesota chapter wrote a bill and got it passed in 2018 that incentivizes landowners who are retiring and transitioning their land to sell or lease that land to young and beginning farmers, so they get a tax break if they do so.
Right.
So that was not a law in Minnesota until 2018, and now it is.
Wow.
And that was largely the chapter doing that work.
Right.
We've also passed an agricultural workforce bill in a couple of different states now in the West. That the state now pays for half of an apprentice on a farm. So if you are looking to hire more employees, labor is really expensive.
Yes.
The states now in New Mexico and Colorado will pay for part of that apprentice's salary. So that is a huge way now that some of our farmers are being able to hire that labor that they need.
Right, and then of course there's the conservation stewardship program.
Yep.
There's EQIP. Are there other programs that are on a federal level that your coalition is working with to sort of, again, boost the financial prospects for young farmers?
Yeah, well, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Act is our student loan debt campaign that we're running right now. The campaign is called Farming as Public Service. So we're trying to add farmers to the existing Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program.
Cool.
Currently, it's teachers, nurses, doctors, government employees, and nonprofit workers are eligible for that program. You make 10 years of qualifying payments, and then you get the rest of that loan forgiven if the program works correctly as the way it's supposed to. So we're trying to get farmers added to that list of occupations that would be eligible. If we could do that, that would be huge. So then a farmer could make 10 years of qualifying payments and then be out of that debt, which would free up that monthly payment money for the things that they really need to pay for their farm. Yeah.
Right. Well, that about wraps it up. Kaitlin Arnold from the National Young Farmers Coalition, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, folks, for listening to the Heritage Radio Network on Tour. Thanks again to the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts for making our on-tour coverage possible, and to the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for having us here at the Young Farmers Conference. I'm Katie Kiefer. Stay tuned for more.
All right, welcome to Heritage Radio Network on tour. I'm Lisa Held. Today we're broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barns. We want to thank the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for making our coverage possible. So now we have a packed panel. Three farmers we're going to be speaking with. Jevon Sage, the alchemist behind Sage's Larder in Georgia. David Bowen of Bowen Family Farms in Missouri. And Jermaine Jenkins, the co-founder and CEO of Fresh Future Farm in North Charleston, South Carolina. Thank you all for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
So you are all from different parts of the country. You all do really different things. So let's just quickly do an elevator pitch. Tell me a little bit about what you do, your farm, your business.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So that's usually a long list of but I'm Jevon Sage. I am the alchemist behind Sage's Larder, which is a multi-level service company that I work as a birth worker, as an herbalist, as a wellness coach, and as a chef. And so for me, I see the intersection of healing ourselves through plants and food. I believe that food is medicine and food is healing, and that also lends into my land-based work with Gilliard Farms, which is our African-American centennial family farm based in Brunswick, Georgia.
Do you work on the farm as well?
I do. My actual apothecary is located on the farm.
Amazing.
But I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh,
So
wow.
got some Missouri
Missouri
action
connections.
happening.
Yes. I'm David Bowen, owner of Bowen Family Farms. And what we do is we work with a lot of plant breeders, seed collectors, and seed smugglers.
Oh, we're going to talk about that.
We won't go deep
We're
into
coming
it.
back to that.
Right. To try and find some of the most delicious stuff that we can grow in our region with the complications that we have with the extreme climates that we kind of deal with our summers and our winters both being very extreme. And most of our product goes to restaurants and chefs. We also do a farmer's market and a very small CSA.
Great. Jermaine?
Hey, everybody. I'm Jermaine Jenkins, co-founder, chief farm officer for Fresh Future Farm in North Charleston, South Carolina. And we operate a farm and a grocery store in a neighborhood that experienced food apartheid since the last traditional grocery store closed in 2005. So we are working to grow jobs and healthy food for people that live in that neighborhood.
So I think what's really cool about this panel is you're all from really different places, despite the past Missouri connection. How does the place that you're in, the land, the community, the people, how does that affect how you do what you do?
I can touch on that.
Yeah.
So Brunswick, Georgia, our farm is about 15 minutes from the beach and 30 miles from Florida. We're Zone 9A. We are subtropical.
Nice.
And this year, as we're, on in many ways, the front lines of how climate change is playing out, we started getting 100-degree weather, 107 in May. Which normally doesn't happen until maybe late June, early July. And it pretty much kept up the 90s and 100s all the way till October. So for us, we're having to rethink how we also approach our land-based work because that's hot, y'all. But we can also grow, for the most part, year-round. I was actually just in the greenhouse here at Stone Barns doing a demo for the farmers where I brought in hibiscus and prickly pear fruit from our farm and also used some of the ginger and the turmeric and the cardamom leaves that are grown here. We also grow cardamom, ginger, and turmeric. It just wasn't ready to harvest. And so for us, think about those subtropical plants that you love to have that rich, pungent flavor of the ginger. Our hibiscus grows to be about 7 to 8 feet tall.
Dang, wow.
So it loves the heat. It loves the rain as well. And so for us, part of that is balancing the different kinds of seeds and stuff that we bring in, finding out what's going to be growing as our climate is doing this kind of shifting. And for us as farmers, like, how can we find new ways to be resilient in the face of multiple hurricanes in the last few years, whereas we normally wouldn't have to worry about any kind of hurricane based on where our farm is at. And so for us, it's finding new ways to be resilient in the face of that, but also like continuing to find that joy in working the soil.
Right. Absolutely.
I'll say that you said, how much does it affect? It affects everything for us, especially our climate, because we're mainly a production, somewhat experimental farm as well, but the weather and the pest pressure and the fungus pressure, and even just the community that our product gets distributed in, it definitely determines what we're growing, what time of the year we're growing it, and where exactly those things are going. And so, like I was saying before, we get fairly hot summers. I said very hot before, but that was before she told us about her summers. Yeah, we get fairly hot summers in Missouri and very, very cold winters, which allows us to grow a wide spectrum of different vegetables and fruits, but it also can be limiting as the hot weather doesn't stay for long enough to grow
Right.
cardamom. We can squeeze the ginger and turmeric crop in, but yeah, it definitely decides where our seeds are coming from. That's why a lot of our seeds come from Japan. A lot of our varieties grow very well here as they do in Japan, where they have hot summers, humid summers, and cold winters. And so,
What do you mean when you say you're an experimental farm?
and I wouldn't say we're an experimental farm, but I will say we experiment more than your average farm.
Just like with the varieties that you grow?
The varieties, the way that we grow certain crops. This year we were gifted some very amazing varieties of turmeric and ginger, like a turmeric and ginger cross that we're calling golden ginger. Apparently, it was found growing wild in Thailand. Well, yes, and a farmer from there moved to Florida and grows it there. And one of my buddies found it at the farmer's market and now grows it himself and shared it with us. Also, some interesting varieties of turmeric, like a green turmeric, white turmeric, black turmeric, yellow turmeric, all which we had decided not to grow in the past because I heard those plants needed partial shade and grow best grown indoors or within a greenhouse or hoop house, because our winter comes a bit earlier
Right.
than some other places where ginger and turmeric grow well. And so this year we experimented with growing them in the fields without cover in the open sun. Basically everything they told us not to do with ginger and turmeric, that's exactly what we did, and it produced an excellent crop. We neglected it. We wanted to see what it would do.
Right.
Grown in, in the least ideal conditions, because we know it will improve when given the attention that it needs. And so we wanted to kind of experiment with how resilient of a crop it could be for us and how hardy it was to the different things that we face, our droughts. One of the reasons that I learned that it ideally has partial shade is because that keeps a consistent moisture, where you don't want the topsoil really drying out too much to get proper root production, rhizome production. And so there were some things to learn to understand the reasons why they grow well in the conditions that most people grow them in. and there were some adaptations that needed to be made so that we could grow them out in the field, but field space is a lot less valuable than hoop house and greenhouse space, and so if we can grow ginger and turmeric out in the field, we're in a lot better place.
Right. Absolutely. Jermaine, do you want to talk a little bit about how where you are impacts your work?
Well, we're probably 5 minutes, from like water where we are in the coastal plains of North Charleston, and similar to what Jevon experienced. It was like 100 degrees in May, so our blueberries were like dried blueberries on the vine, and we are intentional about dry farming. So that's making it real tough. We mulch our beds and such, but we have in a 0.8 acre space like 50 trees on the exterior. We're going to start planting banana trees like throughout our space, so that we can still like be limited on the amount of water we use. But it's also kind of testing like how and when we plant crops, because you can see right there in the field that it's changing from year to year.
Right.
So we're going to plant a lot more banana trees, and I'm hoping to get we have 3 varieties right now. I'm hoping to get like 4 or 5 more.
I need to get some of those too.
Yeah.
And if you've ever had a chance to visit her farm, it's absolutely amazing, because if you've never seen a banana tree in person, they're like the silliest trees you've ever seen in your life. Yeah. And hers are glorious. So
and you would love it because it's a giant herb. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, and we just harvested some bananas before I came here.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's probably most people, especially here, have never seen a banana tree.
No.
Yeah.
I'm moving. I'm leaving my farm. I'm going to go work at their farms and convince them to grow some mangoes too.
Oh no, I'm trying with limited resources, because the whole goal is for people with limited resources to be able to replicate what we're doing. So dry farming, bananas, sugarcane, hibiscus, but the hibiscus was weird this year. And B.J. Dennis, Gullah Chef, told me that his grandfather remembered there being coconut trees in our area. So I just got 2 coconuts. So we're going to try one out in our banana circle and the other in our crop tunnel. So we'll see what happens.
Sounds like really all of you are doing experimental farming.
As a farmer, you have to.
Yeah. And Jermaine, you have an interesting economic model on your farm too that I'd love for you to talk about. And because you run a grocery store too,
Yes,
right?
yes, we
Can you
do.
talk a little bit about that model?
Well, we are intentional in not being a farmer's market because our neighborhood need a grocery store. So in order for us, with limited resources to make it happen, we reuse everything, including the building that is our grocery store. It's a modular building that used to be like a rental car space at a car dealership 6 miles up the road from us. And in that space, just looking at what SNAP requires folks to sell, you only have to have 3 varieties of canned shelf-stable produce, where we have 10 varieties of fresh produce plus a few of the canned, because our customers want the fresh, not the canned stuff. And because we're employing people that live in a neighborhood that's gentrifying, we pay $15 an hour starting salary. But what we found, in addition to that, because we lost a couple good folks because that low quality housing was expensive, we're going to have to work in housing and childcare to keep our workforce. And the goal for us is for people not to stay there unless they want to, but to leave, start their own businesses, hopefully start their own experimental farms, so that we can source products from other people that are doing that work. But it's tough, but it's necessary if we want people with limited resources not to be pushed into the middle of nowhere. But everything in South Carolina is developing, so I don't know where folks will end up in the ocean or something. I don't know. But yeah, so we have to be intentional about fighting food apartheid on a bunch of different levels.
Right. And there's a tension because you're trying to provide affordable food for a community that needs it, but also pay high wages, right, and make your business viable. I'd love to hear from Jevon or David too, if you have any thoughts on just what you've learned over the years in terms of making your business economically viable, so that you can kind of get to more people, but also, pay yourselves. And
Absolutely. Pay yourselves. What's that? So I mean, I think what's also unique for us is that, up until last year, we had actually been running our own restaurant in the city of downtown Brunswick, where we're at. So, for us, our restaurant, I mean, we tried to make as many things as accessible as possible. We taught cooking classes and that kind of stuff. But we also did dinner with like wine and, bottle service and all of that kind of stuff. And so for us, we found that we had to basically create our own lane in order to like make the farm more economically viable for us. So we provided vegetables, all of that kind of stuff for our restaurant. And then for me, one of the reasons they call me the food alchemist is because I make products. So I make value-added products from, kimchi and kraut to kombucha and herbal teas. And so that was one of the ways in which I was able to, pay myself a little something. But it also meant the grind of farmers markets and, infrastructure and, figuring out labor, like who's going to help me be in the kitchen, to be bottling, to be out on the front lines at the farmers market. And so there's, trade-offs to that. We were able to do some really amazing work. Our restaurant was in business for over 4 years. And I think our last year we actually got a James Beard nomination. And so we knew we were doing great work, but as far as like being able to pay ourselves and being able to hire quality staff that can run it the way that we run it, it was one of those things that we ran into challenges with. And it's also the challenge of our area. I mean, for us, our city, our county, we have about 80,000 people who live there. 40% of those folks are below the poverty line. The wealth is actually concentrated on the barrier islands, or what used to be known as the Millionaire Islands. And we have 2.6 million tourists that come through here. So for us, hospitality is like where a lot of our people in our community get jobs. And oftentimes, because of the way the different laws are made here, so many people who come in on visas are often prioritized over the local job force. So we have a lot of unemployment in our communities, especially for our Black part of the community. And so one of the things that we're doing is, working with some of the different agencies to create an actual culinary, like farm to table program, to where we can train our local resource to not just be, a dishwasher or a line cook, but to ultimately take on things like entrepreneurship or management within these places where they're often overlooked for these jobs. And so for us, it's part of, how do you train a workforce to be in those higher positions, to not always be the one who's cut once the season gets a little slow, but that they're actively managing and running these places and have the capacity and the skills to do so. So I think that's like one of our largest like issues is like, how do we get our people into those positions and with those skills? And it's a heart project for us, but it's also the things that we wish we would have had, like the ability to like hire on a server or a cook or a sous or whatever that looked like, who could speak the language of like farm to table dining, and who could, know how to deal with the safety laws and the labeling in the kitchen without us having to always show and teach. And that would have allowed us to like build people up into greater parts of leadership, so then we could go and focus on the other things.
Right. And you work with restaurants a lot, David, right? That's your main market. What are some of the economic challenges that you face, or have you found that there is a really great market for selling to restaurants?
There is a great market for selling to restaurants, I'm sure, in all of these places. In St. Louis specifically, it's a growing food scene, fine dining scene, farm to table. But it comes with its own challenges. I was speaking with a couple of people earlier on this trip just about payment methods. That's always an interesting topic to get into when you're opening a new account or starting a new account with someone, is how do they handle payment? And the standard currently in St. Louis, and I'm not sure, I can't speak about other places, is not cash upon delivery. It is, they'll mail you your check in about 2 weeks from delivery. whenever they send out payments to the rest of their employees. But
Right.
as a farmer, I am not an employee. The restaurants are my customers, and so payment has been kind of an ongoing discussion with a lot of these accounts that we have, as some people outsource their accounting. So that makes payment complicated. And so that's probably, it's a very profitable business. It has been very profitable for us, but if I'm bringing my product someplace in a timely manner, I would only hope that I'm being paid in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if there's any restaurants that exist that you could go in there and say, I'm going to eat 2 days out of this week and I'm going to pay you at the end of the week.
No, that doesn't exist.
It doesn't.
And as a freelance journalist, I feel you on that.
Exactly.
Half of the job is chasing down
Yeah,
payments,
yeah,
and it's crazy.
It's not what we want to be doing. So that's definitely one of the challenges with working with restaurants and markets and things of that sort. It's just figuring out how to make the payment method work for both parties and make it make sense.
Did you want to?
Well, Jevon reminded me of something that I guess for us to be competitive and support the neighborhood through outreach, do sliding scale at our grocery store, we have to draw in customers that don't live there. So we are actively working to bring in grocery product from Black women, minority producers, and we even have some Sage's Lauder tea.
Sage's Lauder?
Yes,
That's
yes,
amazing.
and it's selling out. I gotta restock. I told you. Yeah, but there's probably 10 other products of yours. It's especially when we think about places where people are disproportionately impacted by chronic illness related to food, having that is it the reishi mushroom? We need that tonic at the farm, because people come to us for food that heal internally and externally. Somebody had an infection on the eyeball. Here, slap a collard green on there, and it'll take it all out. But so we're adding components where we train. We have it staged so it's a cultural space, because we talk about ethnobotany and stuff when we do our camps up to grown-up stuff. But we also are going to hire a chef part-time to produce these culturally relevant heat and eat meals using our products. So we're going to be able to have an impact on people's health.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So we have to wrap up in a second, but before we do, I would love for each of you just to give a piece of advice for young farmers who are starting out. You all have these incredible different businesses and are really far along in that journey. So for young farmers who are watching, who need a little help getting started.
The pressure right now. Well, and I'll, because I've been talking to young farmers for the last 3 hours.
Really?
Yeah. I was down in the greenhouse. So, so for me, I think one of the things that I understand is that if you just want to farm and you just want to talk to the vegetables or the livestock or whatever, then you need to go find a farming job. If you want to be a farmer and farm your own land, you get to be a marketer, a social media expert, website builder, experimental seed importer.
Smuggler.
You get to be the janitor, the mechanic, all of those things, because you work the farmer's market and you break down the farmer's market. And so think about that, when you're thinking about what it looks like to be a farmer. There aren't a ton of paying farmer gigs, at least not in the South in that same way. There's a few here and there. But if you're trying to be your own farmer, understand that you are signing up to be an entrepreneur. And you don't get to just sit in the field and not talk to people. Your job as a farmer is to spread the good food gospel in that way, is to have those conversations, to tell people about what they can do with this vegetable. You have to know a bit of culinary. You have to know a little bit about, healing. Like, you really have to be this well-rounded person who, if you don't have the answers, you can find the answers. You have to make sure your farm stand is super cute, baskets, chalkboards, like you have to make it look cute because you have to figure out how do you differentiate yourself from other like organic, sustainable farmers, or how do you differentiate from the sticker farmer who just got a whole bunch of vegetables off of a truck and has their stand set up right next to you? So you have to be innovative, you have to be creative, and you have to be able to connect with people in this deep way because you are the closest connection that the public has to the ground and to the dirt and to where their food comes from. So be ready to do that education.
Absolutely. David?
I want to touch on what she just said about differentiating yourself. That's definitely a very valuable thing, is to have something that sets you apart from the many other food producers in an already established industry. For us, we're still working on beautifying our farm stand, and that's not my strong point. Now, my strong point is sourcing delicious things and finding the best way to cultivate them for us in our operation. And so just know that it's not something that takes off in the first year, really. It's a lot of learning. It's a lot of hours. You're not going to get paid what you wish or what you think your time is worth per hour. You won't. In my experience, I can't speak for you guys, but
You're right.
you're going to be working more hours than you ever have in your life, and it can be discouraging, even with all the uplifting compliments and all the smiling faces of people enjoying the food. It can be discouraging, and you just have to understand that it's not even though the day-to-day can be very challenging, the big picture is what you need to be focusing on and planning on, because if you are nearsighted, you will give up. Don't give up.
Well, I want to piggyback off the great things that both of y'all said, but start with perseverance has to be like in your bones before you start this work, because you're not going to get paid. Some of your crops are going to fail. All of these things that are outside of your control are going to happen. But if you have a well-written vision and know where you want to go, that's what's going to help you get up in the morning. And if you don't know how to zhuzh up your farm stand, that's where you use the resources that are in your own household. Because it was my children and my husband that helped me do this when we weren't getting paid, for us to get to a point where we can pay other people that live in the neighborhood to help us. So don't farm in isolation.
Perfect. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network on Tour. Thanks again to the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts for making our on-tour coverage possible, and to Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture for having us here at the Young Farmers Conference. I'm Lisa Held. Stay tuned for more.
Okay. Welcome to Heritage Radio Network on Tour. I'm Katie Kiefer, and today we are broadcasting live from the Young Farmers Conference at Stone Barns in Pocantico Hills, New York. We want to thank the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for making this coverage possible. We have the dream team here, people, just want you to know. Let's start. We're going to have a little panel that's going to talk about all of the fabulous things that we've learned and heard today and yesterday at the Stone Barns Conference for Young Farmers. My panelists include the wonderful Kate Cox, who is the editor-in-chief, I believe, of the New Food Economy, and then the excellent Lisa Held, who writes for Civil Eats and also is the host of the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network. My next victim here is the incredible Tom Philpott, who has been covering agriculture and politics for at least 10 years, maybe longer. He writes for Mother Jones and also hosts not one but two podcasts. One is The Bite and the other one I've forgotten the name of, but you'll... Secret Ingredient. The Secret Ingredient. And lastly, I have Maddie Oatman here, and Maddie is also at Mother Jones, right? And so this is like kind of the brain trust in a way, part of the brain trust of all of the people who cover food and agricultural policy in the United States. So folks, you've had a day and a half of fantastic panels and learning experiences talking to all these young farmers who, well, young farmers. And I laugh maniacally only because farming is such hard work, as we all know from the coverage that we do. So Kate, why don't you start us off by saying what has caught your attention the most in terms of what you've seen and heard here at Stone Barns?
So I've had a morning here, and it was spent talking to people about how to tell their stories. And so what my primary takeaway so far is that it is very difficult for people to do that. Not just because there isn't enough time, which there isn't, but also it's painful. It's hard to talk about what you do outside of the world you're in. And that was a little bit surprising. So most of the people that came to my little, Lucy from Charlie Brown table to talk said as much. And I pretty much asked people, what's your story? And there was a lot of anxiety and kind of squinting and getting tight. And so what we mostly did was sort of have a therapeutic session about how painful it can be to try and package yourself up into a single sentence, because none of us are a single sentence.
That's right.
And I ended up in sort of a circle of females who find it even harder, I think, to talk about the work that they do and who they are. No surprise there. Not a surprise, but a lot of emotion. So it was refreshing. I think we need intimate connection, and so I think that was my primary takeaway from this morning, is that people are glad to be together and to be able to talk in a room and express concerns and anxieties about the work they're doing.
And did the people talk about, like, when you want to talk about packaging yourself, which is what you were trying to help people understand is part of their job, really. I think when people go into farming, they don't think immediately that they're going to have to do that as well as all the other hats that they wear as a farmer. Telling your story is not easy. What were you able to kind of distill down for them in terms of, advice on how best to make that story, create that elevator pitch for themselves?
So it was interesting, actually. I mean, my take was, your story is not about the product you make or grow or the livestock you are rearing. Your story is you, and it's my job to listen to the conflict and the potential evidence of how you might be representative of other issues, So people came up and sort of told me about what they grew and all of that, and I'm like, let's go a little bit deeper. Let's just get outside everyone here is farming or involved in agriculture in some way. Talk to me about, what you're experiencing, because I'm looking for story. So I actually have a good anecdote for this.
Yay.
I told someone about this earlier today. I was like, this is a great story. I had a young couple come up and say, we're beginning farmers, and this is what we're growing. But it turns out what they were doing was incubating, and they're incubating on a farm owned by a retired couple who are aging out of the profession, cannot afford to get rid of the land, but also can't afford to farm it, and they're meeting the needs of a younger generation. I'm like, that's the story. I mean, I know you grow vegetables, and vegetables are interesting on Instagram, but that's a systemic issue, and that's what we live for, right? And that's what I'm listening for. I want to hear about the travails of being a human being working in this profession. And so I think it's getting people to think about themselves differently outside the realm of their work, and what else they might be able to offer people by way of insight, just by sharing. But it is hard. It is not easy to talk about yourself.
Definitely. Lisa, what's your takeaway been so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that really stands out to me, well, two actually. The first thing is I've been writing a lot over the past few months this year about the economic challenges that young farmers face. I just did a story yesterday in a report that came out from the USDA on some of the real, how many days farmers are working off the farm, the income they're making, which is hardly any, and it can feel really bleak. And just talking to all these young farmers yesterday and today, it feels really hopeful when you actually see people who are making it work and who talk to you about, well, we're doing this really creative thing and we're making it work. And so that's been really cool to hear those stories. And also this morning, even just doing these interviews, every single farmer I think that I talked to talked about climate change, every single one. And even when I didn't ask a question that was directly related, it came up. And they're all thinking about it. They're all affected by it and are experiencing, extreme weather events, but also are all really, really asking hard questions about how what they're doing can help solve some of the challenges we're facing related to the climate catastrophe. So.
Fascinating, absolutely. And Tom, what about you?
I think the thing that I've taken away from the last couple of days is I've just been having a lot of great interactions with people who are here as young farmers and just talking with them. And one trend that I've really noticed is that a lot of the people that I've talked to, a surprising number for me, because I haven't been to a farm conference in probably 7 or 8 years. One of the things that's really surprised me is how many people that I've met up here who are working on a farm, they're farmers, some kind of institutional farm. Lots of people are working on farms that are related to schools. People are working on farms that I've talked to that are directly tied to a single restaurant. And what I'm just sort of thinking it through as I experience it. And there is this massive farming crisis going on right now in the United States, and everyone knows this, we have an aging farm population, and there's this big transition that has to happen, this land transition, as if the average age of a farmer is 65, that's also the retirement age, and so we are facing this transition, and land prices are incredibly high. It's incredibly hard to start an operation that's not on family land, and it's no joke to start one on family land, even if you're not having to worry about rent and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if this isn't pointing, maybe the old model of a farm being passed down generation, or a young person coming out and getting together the financial capital, the sort of loans that it's required to start a farm, and pay those loans off. Maybe that model isn't going to work anymore. And the trend that I'm seeing is maybe new models of preserving farmland in a more community-oriented way, thinking about not just sort of the individual farmer selling into a market, but farming webs. Maybe that's sort of the hopeful take on where it's going. And I've also just been super inspired. I talked to 2 different young folks. When I say young, I mean late 20s, early 30s, working on farms aligned with public schools for at-risk adolescents that have been basically kicked out of schools. And they just both were telling me the stories of how therapeutic it is. And it isn't necessarily that the kids in these schools are going to go on to be farmers, but just being exposed to farming, being exposed to food in a different way is just incredibly, I think, therapeutic. And that thing that we've been talking about for 20 years now is finally taking root is really inspiring to me.
Fantastic. I love that story, actually. That's beautiful. And Maddie, let's hear what you got to say.
Yeah, actually, Tom and I have both reflected on the fact that land use, which all of you just mentioned, seems to be such a big issue. So I spoke with some farmers this morning, two women who are both in different states, both dealing with the fact that they're landless farmers. They're looking for a space to farm. One is looking to farm for the Somalian community in Minnesota that doesn't have a community garden space, and they're trying to do, for instance, raise goats and halal meat, and they can't find that fresh where they are. But there's a huge Somalian population in Minnesota.
There is.
Another woman who's in Oakland and looking to farm medicinal plants for her community and provide fresh ingredients like Tulsi basil, which they're not finding fresh in the area, but is still looking to secure that space, as well as an urban farmer in Brooklyn who has had an amazing urban garden space, but is facing, eviction or, there's a chance they're going to lose that. So that is a little bit of a trend that I've seen as well. I did ask several of these people, though, well, what do you think you'll do next? Kind of expecting that this might force them out of farming, but all of them were, it was very hopeful because all of them were very sure that they were going to be farming wherever that might be. So that was a nice, hopeful element to the interviews.
Optimism of the youth. Not to dismiss that or anything, but still. Cynic that I am. Lisa, you brought something up that I thought was really interesting, which was you discussed sort of how innovative some of these young people are. And I wondered if you would tease that out a little bit. Both you and Tom kind of mentioned sort of the farming web, the collaborative work by either buying property together or buying equipment together, which I know is certainly a trend in my home state of Rhode Island. There's a lot of that going on. Talk a little bit about how they're kind of parsing the difficulties that you face in terms of gaining access to land or capital, and how they're sort of moving on beyond that by working together or coming up with innovative ideas to provide more financial assistance to their products or to their efforts.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a perfect example. I mean, even just on the interview before this, Jermaine Jenkins, I think her farm is a really interesting example of just really creative business model. It's a nonprofit. She created the farm, and then she said, well, the neighborhood doesn't need a market, it needs a grocery store. And then so she opened a grocery store, and the farm sells to the grocery store, and then they source other products to stock the grocery store for the community, and the whole thing's run as a nonprofit. So it's it's an entirely different business model that you sort of wouldn't, not just, let me go find land, start a farm, sell to a market.
And go to a farmer's market.
Yeah,
right.
So that's one example off the top of my head, but I think, there are definitely a lot of, like Tom mentioned, farmers working in institutional settings, creative land use. That's one that stands out to me.
Tom, talk a little bit more about the institutional farming, because I find that interesting. There's Farm to Institution New England. It's a big group up here in the Northeast that really pushes those contracts and tries to get more and more farmers participating in corporate contracts, like working in restaurant chains or hospitals or prisons or what have you, the public school system, et cetera. What are you seeing?
Well, I guess what is striking me as someone who did have a go at farming for 7 or 8 years in the 2000s, when you have a farm operation, you are incredibly financially insecure. Your hours are endless. There's always some field somewhere being neglected that you got to go get to, and it's Sunday and you're exhausted. And you got to go weed that field or plant that next succession or whatever. And it's this incredible grind combined with the financial instability. And what I mean by these institutional farms is these are people, and I think actually where we are, Stone Barns is an example of it.
True.
You are in a farm manager position kind of thing. you have a salary, you have hours, you have a little bit more stability than are we going to sell as many CSA shares as we were hoping? Is our greens crop going to get attacked by flea beetles just before farmers market? And those kind of things are not as existential. And so it brings stability to farming, and it's sort of like it's a form, the old dream of the CSA, and we could have a whole panel on the evolution of the CSA, and I've talked a little bit about that with some young farmers today, but the whole dream of the CSA was that communities would share risk with the farm. And so farming is so risky and so insecure that the community is going to take a share of that. And I think that maybe this institutional thing that I'm just observing is the next phase of that, where if you are a farm that's associated with a restaurant, well, that restaurant is sharing some of the risk of this with you, and the restaurant can go buy, its vegetables on the market if it has to, and it's not like this crushing thing. It can be quite crushing to lose crop no matter what. But you've got a salary instead of just hustling to make that next sale or have that big farmers market day.
Yeah. And Kate, I want to ask you, as the person who is constantly evaluating stories and looking for a story to tell, do you see what Tom is seeing, which is a kind of a change, a sea change in the model of farming with this generation that's coming up? Do you think they're going to end up being, here's a two-part question, which I'm famous for. I always ask 2 or 3-part questions. And I talk for so long, everybody forgets the first part of the question. But I'm just curious, if we talk about a change in the farming system and young people adopt that, are you telling those stories? Are you finding a lot of those stories to tell that would be, say, different from what you told 5 years ago?
Yes and no.
Okay.
But let me talk about the trend that we see on the other side of the supply chain, which is that yes, there is a trend in farming where people are linking up with an institution that permits them to, have some price protection and a, guaranteed customer and all of that. But on the other side of that is that institutions are now, in some cases, being mandated to locally source product. And that's the other side of that coin. So an example would be we covered an effort a few years ago in the University of Maine system had received a mandate from their student body. The students had effectively lobbied to get 20% local sourcing for all the food that's coming into the campus system. And what was really interesting about it was that we covered their RFP, their request for proposals, and it was all the sort of usual suspects, Cisco and Compass and the general, food suppliers for institutions, and then a tiny co-op of 4 or 5 farmers in Maine who said, we're really the right ones to actually be doing local sourcing for you. And that was seafood, they had a commercial fishermen in there, they were growing vegetables. And, it's an interesting kind of point of tension in that for the University of Maine, they were supposed to be doing 20% local sourcing, but that the word local, as we all know, was very wide. So it could be perhaps that they just got all of their ice from a local ice producer and they could fulfill that 20% mandate. So there are still, the dominant players are still the dominant players on the corporate side, but I do think that the demand for food in institutional settings, even in the correctional system, from that to hospital, that they are now having to face looking at local sourcing in a different way, and that but that there are players locally. Wow, what an unbelievable concept.
That
right?
seems totally new to me.
I mean, I was floored, the idea of it. And we looked at the RFP, which was something like 70 pages, and it turns out that whoever's supplying food to the University of Maine is also responsible for supplying pencils and paper and stocking the convenience store, right? And so in the end, the co-op did lose out on the contract because they couldn't be a supplier of all the other stuff universities need. But they got the conversation started. And in that case, I think people felt heartened that a student revolution for better food at least yielded enough interest on the corporate side to show up at the table. And they got a place at the table and part of the conversation. I mean, we covered that story probably 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. and we're still here, right? I don't have another story to replace it. I can say that much.
Right,
So I think yes and no to your first question. I'm also known for long answers to very long questions. I'm like, what am I even talking about at this point? Co-ops, and there's a university involved. Anyway, yes. I'm not sure, though, if it has to do with a new generation of farmers or a different American eater that is demanding access to food in all of the places that they interact with in any given day.
Right. Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I think some of this is like these new models that young farmers are open to and are exploring might be a result of some of the economic constraints, this crisis, and it's really hard to make it work. And so I think there used to be this like, well, I'm going to be a farmer, I'm going to go into a ton of debt buying land, and I'm going to do it on my own. And now it's like that. We've seen that is just really, really hard to do it that way. And so a lot of farmers are more open to, like, maybe it's working for an institution. I just thought of this farmer in Maryland that I wrote about who started a farm, like, in the backyard of her parents' house, and then literally went around the neighborhood and asked all these people if she could grow they had lawns that they weren't using in their backyard, extra property, and all these people just let her, and she grew this farm. It's now one of the biggest, most successful local providers of produce in Baltimore.
And she's making a living.
And they're going to buy land 6 years later.
Fantastic.
Because they went this totally different route that allowed them to, get profits and actually make money first. Maybe part of it is almost like it's hard to do it the traditional way, and so people are more open to.
Well, the traditional way is like you're either a contract farmer farming dairy or livestock, or you're growing grains or corn or soy, and right now those are losing propositions for any farmer. And the only farmers that seem to be doing well are these people who think up a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that those guys who are suffering right now are ever going to go away. Because that's just the nature of global food trade. But I do think it's really interesting to see this new generation coming up that is coming up with some really innovative and successful ideas to make farming work in the 21st century. And that's something that I think is you've all sort of touched on here in terms of this panel, and like the people that you've met here, the stories that you've heard, and the participants in the conference are all demonstrating that they're not happy with the old method, and maybe it'll take another generation. But it sounds like we're onto something quite inspiring and quite exciting. Ooh, I have goosebumps. I have been told that we need to wrap this up, so I will just say thank you very much, Kate Cox, Lisa Held, Tom Philpott, and Maddie Oatman. We didn't hear enough from you. That'll be another time. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network on Tour, and thanks again to the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts for making our on-tour coverage possible, and to Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture for having us here for the Young Farmers Conference. I'm Katie Kiefer. Stay tuned for more.